Oh ho ho ho, so do I have news for you, and that's that I, like you, have been on gamesworkshop.com and I have looked at this announcement about Warhammer the Old World, and I have discovered that Warhammer the Old World is indeed going to be brought back with square bases and rank and flank and 28mm, not 10mm or 15mm, and is going to be taking inspiration from all editions from 3rd edition right through to 8th edition, and it's not going to have any of those silly TM Age of Sigmar kind of names on it. It's going to have proper Warhammer fantasy names. All of this, ladies and gentlemen, has come out in this announcement, thus answering some of the really important questions that die-hard Warhammer Fantasy fans had about Warhammer the Old World. And this is such a magnificent announcement that I should share it with, well, you know who. Hey mate, where are you? Where are you? Hey. Sorry, he's up to something. Oh, here you are. Did you hear what they've done? Did you hear? So you're playing strip poker. Is that really a good excuse? Who are you playing strip poker with? I wouldn't play strip poker with you. Bloody hell not. Malal? Oh, my word. Well, did you hear what I just said about 3rd edition? You might find Malal's going to be brought back. Anyway, you totter off and let's have a little discussion about some of these points. So I just wanted to go through really the bare bones of this announcement, which is really a quite momentous one, I think, since we initially had news that Warhammer Fantasy was being brought back nearly 2 years ago now. All we've really had since then from Games Workshop are a few little snippets. For example, of a sort of a Kislev elite regiment. We've had a little bit from Bretonia, like a map released, and people have speculated that this is going to be set some considerable time before the end times, actually in the War of the Four, or I forget 5, Emperors earlier on in the Old World timeline. But this announcement from Games Workshop, even though it's just presented as a kind of a Q&A, contains some highly singular developments, or some highly singular confirmations of really our greatest hopes. And when I say our, I mean the sort of Warhammer Fantasy fans who have played this game for many, many years and were very, very sad when it was blown up and dearly wanted it to be brought back. Very, very gratifying news from that perspective, and allaying some of perhaps the kind of fears that we were going to get something that was a little bit similar to Age of Sigmar, was going to be in a different kind of scale, was going to mean we couldn't use our old armies anymore, etc. All of those fears, or virtually all of them, I think, have been put to bed by this announcement. So let's have a look at it. So the first thing that it talks about is bases, square or round. Now, I was never too worried about this point because they had teased before that, everything comes round again, even squares. They had highly, suggested that it was going to be square bases. I didn't really feel that afraid that it was going to be round bases. But within this, or what it says about square bases, it talks about ranked up units, strategic maneuvering, rank and flank, etc. Getting your troops into positions to launch or receive critical charges. So it's not just square bases, it's really rank and flank, because, you could always have square bases that are of a different kind. Like, for example, in Kings of War, you've got multi-basing. I know that does have rank and flank as well, but in here, it's clearly implying that you're going to have single models that are on square bases, that the collective of those is units, and you're going to have casualty removal as you go. So it's not just that it's square bases, it's going to be square bases in the real sense that Warhammer Fantasy always was. Not square bases, in the way that, for example, Kings of War or the kind of Game of Thrones game might be. So that is really fantastic news to see that confirmed, although I'm not too surprised on that. Scale, 10mm or 15mm, this is an even bigger one. So there'd been a lot of speculation that this was going to be set at a smaller scale. It was going to be more like that very great and long forgotten game Warmaster, which was of course Warhammer Fantasy, just on a much, much smaller scale. It says very clearly the scale will remain the same as it ever was, which of course was 28mm, and I know some more modern GW stuff has crept up to 32mm, so if they mean that literally, that means 28mm. That means that you're going to be able to use your, your Empire, like halberdiers who are on 20mm bases, who are really very much 28mm figures and not 32mm, a bit like how Chaos Warriors kind of are, which are a bit larger. That means that the scale should be backwardsly compatible. And it even adds on that point, you're free to start new armies or to use your old ones. So it's not going to be the case that Games Workshop are going to be forcing people to buy new armies by changing the scale or doing something else funky. They're going to let Wretched Demon, who you just got introduced to, and his horde of third ed Chaos Warriors and Pink Horrors and Fiends of Slanesh and all of these other things, they're going to be able to march to war again in an officially supported game. I'm not going to have to go and buy a whole bunch of other new models, and that's not because I'm necessarily too tight to do it. It's because I really love ones from the 1980s, and I've got an idiosyncratic reason why I like old models. Other people might have their old reasons. There are other reasons for liking their old models. Perhaps it's just what they've got, and they can't necessarily afford to go and buy a new army. Perhaps it's the era of models that they really like. Whatever the reason is, they will not be forced to upgrade to the latest version. I think that that is a courageous act on behalf of Games Workshop. I think to do anything else would have been slightly suicidal, incidentally, but I do think it proves some people who have been very strident in their opinion that Games Workshop would force diehard fans to upgrade as a kind of gateway into getting the game. Those people's predictions or fears have been proved incorrect and unfounded, and so I'm very pleased that Games Workshop have made that decision. Now, all this being said, of course, what Games Workshop are going to do is what they have always done with getting people to upgrade. You may note that in Warhammer Fantasy before there were no changes to the scale or the bases, but Games Workshop was still able to shift huge numbers of their new models, and the reason for that is because they made great new models that were consistent with evolving ideas of aesthetic design, used new kind of sculptors, used sometimes new technology in terms of sort of plastic moldings and multi-pose, etc. And this enabled Games Workshop models to always be more attractive than the older models were, or models from rival manufacturers. And so Games Workshop are going to make this game pay by selling the customers really good products. You are going to be buying GW miniatures because you want to buy them, because they are really good, really pretty, yeah sure, of course expensive, not because you are being forced to by a decision they make on scale so that you have to buy new models to actually play the game. I think that's a great decision. And it enables the whole of the wargaming community, people who are much more open to buying new models, who actively want to go and buy new models, and people who are stuck in the 1980s like me, to still be able to meet together over gaming tables and play the same game together. That is a magnificent announcement, in my opinion, and I take my hat off to Games Workshop for that. Games Workshop get a lot of stick, they get a lot of criticism. It can very often in this age of the internet turn into something quite toxic sometimes, but as far as I'm concerned, I've been strident with my criticism of Games Workshop in the past. You've got a big thumbs up from me, and I will persuade myself maybe to buy some of your new models, even though I am sentimentally still stuck in the 1980s. The next thing it says is the rules. Totally new or 8th edition. Now, this is nice. 8th edition. You've seen those words on a Games Workshop website for the first time in a very long time. An acknowledgement that yes, there were 8 editions of Warhammer Fantasy before the old world was blown up. The 8th edition was the last edition. The universe that Total War is set in is 8th edition. But of course, there were a lot of other editions before 8th edition, 7 of them, fairly obviously. And they say here, Games Workshop, that they're going to be using both rules from 8th edition and also some new rules, but then also that they've looked back into the past of Warhammer Fantasy and are taking the best bits, their favourite mechanics, from the 3rd edition all the way up to the 8th edition. Now, I really like that historical callback. It would have been very easy to have just said, yeah, there's going to be a bit old and a bit new. But they've made a specific reference here to going back to every edition from 3rd edition. They've even put some little asterisks there to explaining that the 1st and the 2nd editions of Warhammer Fantasy were much more role-playing game-like in their nature, and 3rd Ed was the game where the mass battlefield Warhammer Fantasy that we know and love was really born. And I really like the fact that they have done that. Now, there are some very important things I think here to bear in mind. The first thing is that 8th edition really seems to be their kind of mainstay, their last known good configuration of the rules. Now, most Warhammer players, if they're asked, what kind of Warhammer Fantasy rules would you like the new version of Warhammer to be, they'll say 8th edition. Some of them may say that because they genuinely think 8th edition was the best version of the rules, or many of them will say that because obviously there are the largest number of people that are sort of kind of still around now that remember 8th edition because it was the last sort of known good configuration of the game. And it's really, really nice to see that they are interested in looking at 8th edition. Now, of course, there is another game in town here which isn't being mentioned here, and that is the 9th Age. That is effectively the fixed version of the 8th edition rules. Tournament players looking at the 8th edition rules, ironing out all of the kinks, making it super balanced and fit for competitive play. Not necessarily general play, but competitive play. Now, the 9th Age fixed a lot of the problems with 8th edition. Sometimes those fixes were elegant, sometimes they were a little bit cumbersome, but I'm quite sure that if Games Workshop are looking at 8th edition, they're going to be looking at some of the really, really cool things that those guys in the 9th Age have also done and taking some inspiration from that. But then the older editions, I find that callback quite fascinating. Now, 3rd edition. Probably very few of you who are listening to this will remember 3rd edition or know very much about it. 3rd edition is even before my time. But because I'm very interested in the history of the game, I have read up on the 3rd edition rules, and of course I've got an army of 3rd edition models. 3rd edition was, I'm going to be probably slightly controversial in saying, probably the best version of Warhammer Fantasy in my opinion. And when I say the best, I mean the most sophisticated, the most evolved, the most rich, the most developed. Not in terms of lore, but in terms of rule set. The 3rd edition rules, if you have ever read them, are incredibly complicated. They are incredibly detailed. There are many different forms of formations, for example, that troops can use. Snaking, forming squares, various line formations, all of which have got different rules in the game. There are different characteristics on the profile. There's not the divide. See, in Warhammer, leadership is used both to describe your bravery, if you like, and also the discipline of troops, how easily they can reform and march about, which is of course really silly because a bunch of nutters might be really brave, but they might be really, really undisciplined. In 3rd Ed, there isn't that distinction. You've got, as well as leadership, you've got cool, willpower and intelligence as other sort of personal characteristics in there. And you've also got all manner of other very, very sophisticated things in 3rd edition. Much, much more complicated psychology. You've got the idea of things like pushbacks and stuff in combat. I'm not going to go into the history of 3rd edition, but what I'm saying is that even though this happened a long time ago, in the mid to late 1980s, they're still prepared to look back at these very old games to see if they can find mechanics that can be transported, can be used to make this new game even better. You then got 4th and 5th edition, of course, which came hard on the heels of 3rd Ed, with this sort of kind of the so-called Hero Hammer edition, which one day I'll make a video of actually explicitly defending, because I know it has a bad reputation, but I think 4th and 5th edition were actually really good and should not be known as Hero Hammer. But nonetheless, lots of really cool things in there with things like sort of magic items, the diversity of the different races expressed in various different sorts of ways. A very different kind of magic phase as well, a card-driven magic phase where it was like you were playing poker. Very, very exciting. Then you've got 6th edition. This was a great reset in Warhammer history that happened at the time of the millennium, a great time to be a fantasy fan around the time of the Lord of the Rings movies coming out. 6th edition was an incredibly popular edition of Warhammer Fantasy. Great simplification in the rules, but also fixing many of what were perceived to be, partly incorrectly in my opinion, some of the broken aspects of 5th edition. And 6th edition had, of course, its reputation for being very balanced, a very kind of back to basics kind of edition that was perhaps a little bit more analogous to a sort of a military war game, or a little bit more on that scale. They're going to be looking at that, 6th edition. That's got a lot of very big supporters who play it even now. I can understand why, because it's a really, really good game. And then moving up to 8th edition, as I say, which has the largest, probably sort of player kind of diaspora, but they're going to be looking into that as well. So all of these editions are going to be looked at. I'm sure they're going to be looking at 9th Age as well. I'm sure they're going to be looking at other games that exist, like Kings of War, for example. You might want to look at that for some of the things like the missions, some of the objectives, some really cool stuff there as well. And so they're going to be deliberately historical in what they're doing. And I really, really like that. They are aware that this isn't a new game being drawn up on a blank canvas. It is the latest installment of a very rich heritage, which goes back many, many, many years. And, while Warhammer lore may have its detractors in terms of being a sort of generic fantasy lore, etc., while many of the rules were sort of off-putting and broken, whatever, the fact is that this is something which has grown up with its player base. It was the work of many heads and many hands, some of the best minds in fantasy gaming in that great heroic age in the 1980s, moving forward into the 90s, around the time of the millennium, the time of the Lord of the Rings movies, and that kind of, real sort of genesis point or re-engagement of the kind of fantasy mind. All of these things will be being used or raided, I suppose, and the past will be pillaged in order to get ideas to make this game. And there will be these deliberate callbacks kind of here. The awareness that this is the latest leg in a relay race, that this is the next chapter in a book that has already had many, many good chapters before it. I really like that historical aspect of Warhammer Fantasy. That's one of the reasons why I didn't like Age of Sigmar as much, because it represented drawing up a new world on a completely blank canvas, which obviously has a lot of energy and a lot of interest because you're starting from nothing. But this is a story which has grown up with many, many people and has a place in their hearts, and the next generation is going to get a chance to write their own chapter in this story. And that historical mindset, I may almost say a Burkean kind of mindset, to use a philosophical reference, is what seems to be inspiring them, and I really, really like that. Apart from that, there's a point about the names. Is it going to be orcs or orcs? And they say, yes, we're going to be using the proper kind of terms. That is important, but at the same time, I don't think it's that important. Games Workshop realise that this is not something that can be defended through copyright in the same way as perhaps Age of Sigmar can be, because, of course, it leans very heavily on Tolkien. It leans on all manner of fantasy influences where elves are elves, dwarves are dwarves, orcs are orcs, and changing those names doesn't enable you to draw on that very rich history of folklore, fairy tale, the shadow of Tolkien, etc. And they're prepared to live with that, even though they can't defend the IP. Again, big thumbs up from me. I think that's an impressive and a brave kind of move. In terms of the old world setting, they say it's set several hundred years before the end times, and this enables us to focus on a different part of Warhammer history. I think that that's nice. I think that that's interesting. I think the fact that there's been so much excellent Warhammer lore written with so much of a focus, perhaps an unhealthy focus on Karl Franz and Archaon and the kind of sort of personages that were around at that time in the Warhammer history, the fact that we're going back into an earlier age, I actually think is really quite nice and quite interesting. And I really like the idea that you can jump around in the Warhammer historical timeline. That's something that I think is a really nice kind of innovation that in some ways is slightly borrowed from Age of Sigmar, because in Age of Sigmar it seems there's less of a kind of conception of sort of time and space. You can be in there's a lot more flexibility with where games can happen, when they can happen, etc., within the more sandboxy kind of setting that's Age of Sigmar. I like the fact that we're going back into the past here. That gives a little bit more flexibility than it always was when the world was on the brink of collapse, with Archaon collecting all this stuff and all the rest of it. Sorry, I don't like Archaon very much. And that's really the main kind of substance in the announcement. But I am extremely pleased to see these announcements made. I'm actually kind of intrigued that they didn't confirm this actually when the game was released, because I'm sure they would have known this. I'm sure they would have known it was a rank and flank game, that it was going to be 28mm, that it was going to be taking inspiration from existing Warhammer Fantasy editions. It's interesting that they didn't announce that, because that, as I say, would seem to me to be something they would have undoubtedly known at the outset. I don't really mind the fact that they didn't do that. Obviously, many words were expended on the internet by people on keyboards, arguing one way or the other, etc. But now, of course, we finally have that confirmation that what we have hoped, and I think I speak for all of us in this, both my major audience, which would be Warhammer Fantasy players, but also people who have got into Age of Sigmar and maybe who have played Total War, who are interested in what Warhammer was like before Age of Sigmar, who are interested in seeing, what all the fuss is about, what all these old men, for the most part, are ranting and raving about. And now you will be able to take your pick and indeed, of course, to play both games. One of the really nice things with this, which is something I speculated when The Old World was sort of first announced and released, will be that hopefully Age of Sigmar and Warhammer the Old World will be complementary games. They will not be any more at each other's throats. Age of Sigmar will no longer be seen as the game that killed Warhammer Fantasy. They will both be games that exist, within the same broad universe, but of course Age of Sigmar happens afterwards. And so hopefully a similar relationship to what the 40k has with Horus Heresy. And you never know, it may even be possible that some people, probably not me, might even give Age of Sigmar a go now they've got a supported game. So, there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. And so now, I guess I'm off to go and do some painting. And what is it, mate? What is it? You're planning an orgy? An orgy? And who are you planning an orgy with? You're not planning an orgy with Nurgle, are you? What? Nurgle got all his way with the pandemic, so why can't we have an orgy on the Age of Slaanesh? Do you know what, mate? I think that might not be a bad idea.